morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. Today, I hope you join me in welcoming back one of our most appreciated guests, Denise Findlay, to talk to us today about Indigenous healing rituals through the lens of the science of attachment. Science of attachment and emotion. Sorry, I tripped up a little bit there. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations health authorities for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. So as a quick reminder, for everyone participating today, the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive depending on kind of who you are and where you're coming from. So if that's you for today, please, we urge you kind of engage in some self-care. Look to access your support networks, if that happens to be an elder or a friend, family member, counselor, whatever it is that you need. Please make sure you're getting that care. So, quick introductions before we launch into it. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chowthil First Nation. I'll be facilitating the session today. Other Learning Circle team members in the room but off camera are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Kaylin, our program assistant. So, on to the main event. Denise is a bicultural woman who belongs to the Squamish Nation. She's a faculty intern, facilitator, and parent consultant dedicated to supporting adults to make sense of children. Denise works extensively with First Nations in British Columbia and other parts of Canada, and is a wife and mother to two highly sensitive, intense, and bright boys. Denise's passion for the Neufeld approach was ignited when she sought support as a parent and experienced Dr. Neufeld's teachings to be in complete alignment with her deepest intuitions about parenting. Denise has been able to share her insights with Indigenous parents in helping professionals to empower them to be their child's best bet and to look to traditional approaches to parenting that focus on attachment and lifelong whole person development. Mm-hmm. Denise works with all adults wanting to make sense of children and youth using Dr. Neufeld's insight and evidence-based model of attachment and development to tease apart complex issues. She has experienced training educators, parents and parent groups, social workers, early childhood educators, mental health practitioners, and other helping professionals. Denise provides one-to-one support to adults wanting to make sense of children. She also provides presentations and trainings for parents, educators, social workers, and mental health professionals. So, Denise, with that, I'm going to kind of pass over the mic. Why don't you start us on this journey?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful day here. It was so nice driving over, actually. It put me in a great mood. It seems like we've got our rainy weather prematurely this year, and I was feeling a bit down about that, but this morning it's a gorgeous fall day. I'm really happy to be back here. My work continues to unfold, and I've sort of landed on this particular area around rituals, or maybe it has found me and drawn me into this direction. So I'm sort of just starting this journey of really looking at how rituals, how important they actually are to all peoples, but especially Indigenous peoples, and being part of so many beautiful rituals in my own community and in my own family, knowing the powerful impact they have. I've been connecting the dots between, child development and healing and recovery from trauma, and how rituals actually can create the conditions for healing to occur. Mm-hmm. There's a whole bunch of new research on play these days, and I'm sure anyone in the helping field will be exposed to sort of different things on social media or on the news about the importance of play and how this is sort of being rediscovered. Mm-hmm. I mean, play is just a natural part of human instinct or mammal instinct. We all have the instinct to play, but we're starting to really see, wow, play is something that's being lost, and because of social media and this work mentality that we have. Everyone's so busy and at work, and we're even working at our healing. And one of the things that and you'll have to, today I might stumble through a little bit because I am at the beginning of this and I'm piecing it together. And so this is such a great opportunity for me to share, my early thoughts about this, because I plan on continuing to research and dig and clarify this as I move forward. But in my work as a facilitator, when I'm hired to go into a community or an organization to do healing work or process-oriented work, it's usually because people are healing from trauma, or they've been impacted by trauma, and people are struggling with bullying and aggression and all of these sorts of things. So, I sort of have a reputation as knowing stuff about lateral violence or lateral kindness, and I've been here and I've talked about those things before. But the most recent training I did for a health department, we spent a lot of the day in group process and in a ritual-like format, in a circle. And so instinctively, I've always done that. I've always put people in a circle. I've always passed the feather around. I've always honored this sacred space that gets created, knowing that there is immense and profound power in that to heal. And it's an indirect approach. And so what I've come to realize now, and I think one of the things I really grapple with when I get hired to do work, is that people want to talk about the problem, and they want to do problem solving and really tackle the problem directly, if it's lateral violence or bullying or aggression or healing. And what I've really come to understand is that in Indigenous ways of knowing and being, nothing's ever direct. And so as I unfold rituals here today, you'll see that rituals create the conditions for something really, really important to occur for people without having to talk about the problem. And so one of my recent conversations after I did this workshop, this training for this health department, one of the participants said, well, we need to talk more about lateral violence. We need to talk more about what to do. And I said, this is where it's a challenge for me to communicate this, that it's not, we actually don't need to talk more about that. What we actually need to do is get back to providing those things that have been lost, that have led us into this place. We are here with these problems because of what we've lost culturally. And if we restore what has been lost culturally, we'll restore balance. Much like a naturopath or a homeopath would work, really, when you think about it. They're looking at, what do we put in to create the balance? What's missing here that needs to be added in that can create the conditions for healing? Not looking at, what is the problem and tackling the problem in that direct way. And that's the impact of colonization on our thinking about things and where we are today. And some of you, this will really resonate and make sense. And you'll understand what I'm saying around how difficult it is to convey that to audiences who have been very conditioned by the Western or contemporary educational system. It's a paradigm shift when you think it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that what I'm getting from this is, like, when you're talking about it, is kind of moving away from pathologizing a lot of what happens, right? And talking about it very specifically. I think myself and many others that kind of work in the field broadly, we talk about coming at things from a strength-based perspective. And okay, what can we do? What can we do? What are our strengths? What can we continue to build positivity in the community, or in this case, in the individual or in the smaller communities, to practice these more, positive mental and emotional health habits, I suppose. So that's what I'm thinking about when I'm hearing it. It makes total sense, because constantly focusing and giving airtime to, I don't want to call it a problem, but these negative things that we tend to focus on, isn't always the way forward.
The symptom, right? It's the symptom again of something that's gone wrong or something that's been missing. And for Indigenous folks, it's the loss of culture, and ritual being a huge part of that, and this very indirect way and of ensuring that these sacred spaces are protected, which I'll talk about more. An opportunity for people, without having to think about it, to enter into a space where the conditions are conducive to healing. So the name of this presentation, this short presentation, is Indigenous Healing Rituals as Emotional Playgrounds, because we know that emotions have to move in order for healing to occur, that emotions have to feel free to come out for healing to occur. And play as I said before, is a really hot topic right now, because they're realizing that play affords us, whether you're a child or adult, whether you're doing some sort of artistic expression or you're actually just playing in a sandbox, if the conditions are right, the emotions move and there's healing. And I've made this link, well, in my discussions and in my internship with Dr. Gordon Neufeld, we've had some really lively discussions around this link between, oh my goodness, a ritual. There's all kinds of different rituals, but rituals that are healing rituals, they are emotional playgrounds. Our emotions are free to move in a ritual. And there's certain conditions that have to be met for that to actually happen, for it to be a healing experience for somebody. I actually just had a talk with him this week, my monthly check-in with him, and I was saying, so many of you who know me know that I've sort of been on this journey of losing my husband and grieving that, and I have 2 little boys at home. And what I noticed recently is that the 2 years later, because it's almost 2 years now, that we've been blindsided by this whole other wave of grieving and emotion that's come. And in my discussion with him, it was really interesting to see retrospectively that the first part of the grieving journey was really just overcoming the event, overcoming the death, overcoming the loss.
Yeah.
But now we're in the throes of our everyday life, and we're having to adapt to living without him. And that's a whole different ballgame. That's a whole different thing. And we talked about how important it is to have rituals where we can feel sad, where our sadness can come out, where our tears can come out, and to do that very, very intentionally. And that when there's a ritual that you can count on every week or every month, even the kids and I know this is our time to remember Daddy. This is our time. And we do this with memorials. You see this, that's why we do this every year or every so many years with people we've lost in the community. It's an opportunity to not only remember them and celebrate them, but it's an opportunity for our emotions to move and for us to continue to adapt to that person no longer being there. In my research, the earliest rituals, I think 150,000 BC, were all death rituals in all cultures that existed at that time, which is really fascinating to me, but makes sense because death is a universal experience. It's a universal human experience. And so there were rituals to help with the separation that we faced around this. So it's one of the easiest things to talk about because everyone experiences that. And we can understand rituals in that context. And it's the biggest thing that we have to heal from. So it just blew my mind to think about how the loss of culture for many people who don't have access to rituals and culture and teachings, that what truly has been lost is an opportunity for healing. And how do we start to bring these things back in the day-to-day lives of our people? Not just, once every couple of years, but what needs to happen so that we're embedding rituals in our day-to-day life to make room for these things, to make rooms for our emotions, because everyone's so busy and we're working so hard, and we're even working at our healing, which is kind of ridiculous. That's not something we should be working at. It's something that should happen automatically if we create the right conditions. So
Yeah. I think so. Kind of just so I understand, what we're saying here is that in a sense that rituals almost provide, the scaffolding and the structure around creating a free space for us to feel those emotions, right?
Absolutely.
It's like it's physically, mapping out a space for us to do that. Yes. Is that kind of what we're hearing?
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. And we can even apply this to something as simple as a mealtime ritual. A family dinner around the table ritual, which actually is at risk of being lost for many families now because of busyness.
I was going to say, I don't remember the last time.
There's places, there are places in the world where a mandatory sit-down meal happens 3 times a day. And it's not about the meal. Yes, we're eating and we're getting sustenance during that time, but the family, the eating ritual, the mealtime ritual is creating a space for all these other kinds of things to happen that provide the conditions for recovery to happen. It's, time to connect. People feel, it's a time to feel safe, feel cared for, to feel nourished, that we can express ourselves in different ways in that context. So again, a very simple example of a ritual
Yeah, that
that's
makes total
becoming
sense.
extinct. Yeah. And it is hard to get kids to the table these days. I have 2 of them myself. Very hard. And it's like we need good, strong leaders in our families that can see the importance and lead people into this place. So, yeah, Indigenous healing rituals as emotional playgrounds, and there's some lovely pictures up there that depict dancing, connecting. There's the medicine wheel with the feathers there and the 4 directions. And rituals are universal. They can be universally applied. There may be different ones in different societies and different cultures, but ritual in and of itself is a universal thing. And Joseph Campbell, who I'm loving right now and just like devouring all of his work, master teacher, says ritual is the enactment of myth, the mythologies of the world. And every culture has mythologies and stories that help lead us through difficult things, to help us come to new understandings about ourselves and our existence and things like that. So when we do a ritual, we're enacting myth. And it's very, very powerful. And for those of you that participate in rituals, you'll know that. Yeah.
It's very interesting. It's almost, in this process of kind of moving forward, as society, I feel like society has changed a lot with the advent of, or the invention of kind of all the access to technology that we have now. And I think that in some ways it creates isolation within families and for people, because as we all know, social media can be an incredibly isolating experience, but it's also an incredibly addictive one. And I think that as people move away from these rituals, like using the dinner time ritual as an example, or the meal time, let's say, right? For my family, it was always dinner time, so that's why I made that mistake. When I was growing up, but family models we've seen a move away from that, and it's funny now that we kind of look back or that we're looking at it now and thinking, okay, why did we do this? Why did almost every culture share meals together? Why is that something that happened? And it's a really good thought on why that could be the case, and it makes perfect sense in hindsight, kind of the importance of moving back to those things. It's almost like we're recognizing the value in things that we had initially forgotten what it was what the purpose of it was for. You know what I mean?
Well, you're right on about that. And I mean, certainly when we think about eating rituals, mealtime rituals, feasting rituals that exist in every culture, in every civilization, it's not just about eating the food, because you could do that anywhere. We can have a meal in our car while we're driving. So there's so much more there that actually, this is the thing. It's not really meant to be understood or talked about. It's just meant to happen very indirectly. And when we have a ritual that's been passed down from generation to generation, we just do it because we've always done it and we don't need to think about it. And it provides for something that should remain unconscious. But now, because we're doing everything directly and we've lost some of this, now we're having to think about these things. We're having to carve out space and think about these things. And that's part of the problem, is we were never meant to think about these things. They were just supposed to be embedded in these things that we did, these rituals that we did.
Kind of akin to a conversation between old friends. If you talk about how awkward it is, then it's going to feel awkward and stifled if you call that into the room. But if you just ease into it and just sit there with it for a while, let it unfold, then it always feels better, right?
And I think about some of the really wonderful elders that I've met in my journey, some in my own community, but certainly I've met so many in other communities. And what strikes me about them the ones that are really wise and that you feel safe with, and you know the ones I'm talking about, right? That there's not a hurriedness, but there's not this sort of need to address anything directly or call it out. There's something that happens, and there's this knowing and this wisdom, but it's all sort of in the background in my interactions with people like this. And even a teaching, to ask for a teaching directly, that's not going to be given directly. It's going to be given through a story of some sort or an experience of some sort, right?
Yeah. Which also kind of, I'm seeing a link there between kind of what we know about kind of educating, and like myself in my other life, I'm a soccer coach, and I'm really passionate about youth, and we've often found, at least from my experience, that the best way for athletes and for students to learn is to set them up in a general system and let them problem solve it themselves, let them come to it themselves. And that's almost akin to what you're saying, and not calling it out directly, not providing those teaching directly, but rather indirectly, and letting the student come to it on their own, making the lesson that much more impactful. We all know that when we discover something for ourselves, it sticks with you, as opposed to somebody just wrote kind of talking about it. It's in one ear and out the other, right?
Well, I mean, we could have a ritual whereby, and I think it's so important, and again, I think it's something that's lost, but rituals where children spend time with elders in relationship, and that this is something that just happens automatically at a certain time on a certain day. Unfortunately, we don't have homes where multi-generations are living and grandparents are in the home, and that these rituals are just embedded in the life of a person in the home, but certainly in the school systems and other places in our communities where children have this opportunity to sit in ritual with an elder, for those teachings to come out and those experiences to be had. It's incredibly powerful, and it's hard to put words to it, because it's almost like when we put words to it, something gets lost, and some sort of knowledge gets lost in translation. So it's tricky. So I'm conflicted even doing that, like bringing this to the fore, because it's like, okay, to talk about it is important now, because we have to really understand the cost of what has been lost and why it's so important to bring it back in a really, like, in a real way on a day-to-day basis for people, because many of our communities are in crisis, and people are really, really suffering, and yet talking about it, I feel we just need to do it. We need to create these opportunities. So Indigenous healing rituals as emotional playgrounds. Let's talk about this a little bit more. And then I should have time today to answer questions for folks.
Cool.
So about ritual. Ritual is an intended pattern. I love this. It's an intended pattern of actions that is repeated for a purpose other than the actions themselves. So it's not just about going through the motions. And I've seen that done.
Yeah.
Have you seen that done, where it's just about going through the motions?
Definitely.
It's an intended pattern of actions that is repeated for a purpose other than the actions themselves. And a ceremony is a ritual that is performed on a certain occasion. So we can have all kinds of rituals that unfold every single day that create conditions for healing. A ceremony is, let's say a potlatch, or a naming ceremony, or a funeral, or a marriage, or we have a baby ceremony at the Squamish Nation. And that's a larger sort of event that's performed on a certain occasion. But rituals can be small things, like going for a daily river bath, or smudging, or praying, or your family eating ritual. I have a ritual with my children when I drive them to school in the morning. That is a ritual. And I'll explain as I go. I'll explain, how do we know that a particular pattern of actions is providing healing conditions for somebody?
Okay.
right?
What is the difference between something that's a ritual and something that you just kind of do monotonously, I suppose?
Well, like a ritual, yeah, I mean, and you could have a ritual, like an attachment ritual, where we shake hands and we make eye contact and we greet. That's not necessarily going to lead to healing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you see.
Yeah,
So we
yeah,
need to sort of differentiate this.
Right.
So a ceremony is a ritual that's performed on a certain occasion, and you could, if you think and reflect in your own lives, you'll have been exposed to many of those
Mm-hmm.
in different cultures.
Yeah.
It can characterize a culture or a religion, right? So there's different cultures have different specific rituals that you'll know that belongs to that culture and that came from that culture,
Mm-hmm.
right? But this is really important. This one blew my mind. It protects, or can and should protect, the important from the urgent.
Hmm. Okay.
So when we have a ritual that we do on a regular basis that is repeated, it is protecting something that's very important from being eclipsed by the urgent.
Mm-hmm.
So the busyness of life.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's protecting time for connection. It's protecting time for relationship. It's protecting time for feeling our emotions. And I've heard Dr. Neufeld say this, and it just really, really stuck with me. We don't need to feel all the time, but we do need a time to feel.
Yeah.
And this is what's missing, is we're so busy in our lives that we're not slowing down to enough that and creating safe enough spaces for those emotions to move, for healing to occur. Because we're in the work, like I said, we're in the work mode around our healing.
Mm-hmm.
We're working at our healing.
Yeah, and I think kind of to add on to that point as well, even the things that we do, the activities that we engage in, even in our downtime, don't really allow us that space to really think or to critically think and reflect on how we feel and to feel those emotions. Particularly, I'm thinking about, okay, what do I do when I sit down at the end of the day? After I've taken the dog out for a walk, after I've done my chores, after all that stuff, like a 10-minute window between, before bed, and I'm sitting there, and what do? I pull out my phone and I play a game, or I read stories, or I catch up on emails, or I do work.
Yeah.
But it's all from that mobile connected device.
Mm-hmm.
And upon reflection, you're not really thinking about the day. You're not really processing what happened. You're just stimulating until I pass out. You know what I mean?
Yes. And I know you before we started today, you were asking me about the link between social media and anxiety and depression and things like that. And, it depends on the person and what's going on and what you're doing with your device. I don't want to vilify all devices and vilify. Yeah. I want to be careful with that. But devices and social media and electronics can certainly interfere with and come in between ourselves and that which we need most, which is connection to other people.
Yeah.
And relationship, and rest in the nervous system. And it is addictive, because when you think about Facebook and you think about some of these, and I'm on Facebook, and who isn't on Facebook? My dad's not on Facebook. My dad doesn't even have a phone. Okay. But
one of the few.
That it's like Dr. Neufeld says, there's nothing more addictive than something that almost works. So when we go on Facebook and we get a little hit, it's a fix. It gives us a little bit of something that we need, but it doesn't give us what we really need. So we need more, and we need more, and we need more, because it's not satiating us like the real thing will. And it can interfere, and we can become alienated this way.
Yeah.
And it's less vulnerable than real relationship.
Quite a bit more,
yeah. So yes, rituals protect the important from the urgent in our busy lives. And when I do a training, I always sit in circle in the beginning, and I give that I give that priority because it's time for rest. I talk about this. It's time for rest. It's time for connection. It's time for relationship. I pass the feather around. It emotions are welcome. There aren't a lot of parameters, and it's like something happens in that moment. There's a sacredness. And I've heard people say, I don't know what that is. What happens? And I said, it's the mystery. I'm not sure either, but people feel safe, and we shift out of the work mode into this different state. And something that is hard to put words to happens for people there. And I think the fact that it's hard to put words to it, you know, people want to quantify it, because we've been conditioned to think this way, like, okay, like what are the steps and what are we aiming for, and then we take away from there has to be sort of this honoring of what this can do for us.
Honoring that great mystery of what it is.
Absolutely. And this is what we're missing today. And I stand by that, even though it takes up a lot of time. People, I've never had anyone come away from a circle saying, oh, that was, you know, not good, or that was, why did we do? No, people are like, oh, wow, thank you. You know?
Yeah.
So it's protecting something that's really important, but not necessarily what we see as urgent. Now, this is also really, really, really interesting to me. Volition is suspended. For example, agency, intention, and will during the duration of the ritual. So if you've ever been part of a ritual, you feel like you go into a different time and space. And now when you're inside of it, you are not asserting your own will. You're not in the work mode. You are not having to make any decisions in that space. You're part of something, and it's unfolding, and you're flowing with that process. And that's really, really important.
Yeah. I can't help but feel like I'm seeing a connection to a lot of our conversation from last year regarding play, particularly here when we're talking about volition being suspended. So we're taking away that kind of that higher level cognitive thinking that's like, you know, that's constantly looking down at yourself and judging yourself, or thinking about, okay, how do I appear to other people, or how is this relating to my social status, or any of that nonsense.
Right.
You just kind of take that part out of it.
Yes.
And engage, you know, in play when you're playing. But here you're just engaging in the ritual. It's almost something that you can do, I don't want to say on autopilot, but something that's simple. You know what I mean?
Well, I think it is a little bit on autopilot, and I think that that's okay. And I don't mean that we're checking out. I think we're present, and we are engaged, and we're in awe, and we're fully participating, but we don't have to make any decisions when we're in that process. The ritual makes the decisions for us. The ritual is laid out. It's a pattern of actions that we follow. It's been done a certain way over and over and over and over again. And so we give ourselves over to that. And there's rest in that for people.
Yeah. I remember reading a study once that was talking about kind of had a theory about the way that people make decisions, and that people had like a bank of will, I suppose, or a bank have you of kind of decision making energy, let's call it, during the day.
Oh yeah.
And that every time that you make a decision during the day, whether it's a small one or a big one, that you kind of take away that like force of will that you had, to the point where when you get drained, then you start just going with the easiest options, which is, you know, like when you're tired, are you going to come home and you're going to spend the time to make like a really nice, healthy gourmet meal, or are you going to grab, you know, a bowl of breakfast cereal at midnight?
Right.
Probably going to do the breakfast cereal at midnight because you're tired, right? And that was kind of what this theory was hypothesizing. I don't know if it's connected here at all, but I'm saying
I think people are just burnt out.
We actually have a couple questions. Do you mind if we maybe take a
go
quick
for
second?
it. I hope I can answer them.
So the first question, how do you suggest respectfully approaching the importance of rituals with Indigenous families who seem to have not made much connection with them when working with them in a counseling setting?
Does that mean, I guess I need to ask a clarifying question.
Sure, yeah.
Does that mean that you're working in a counseling setting with a family and you've tried to enact rituals and they've resisted them and not seeing the importance or interest of them? Is that what the question is? And how do you lead folks like this into that place?
Yeah. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Please, I don't want to mispronounce your Gitika, please, circle back around and offer that clarification. We'll come back to it.
Well, I can elaborate. So let's stay on one thing at a time, and then if she types in a response to that. I'll build on that.
Mm-hmm.
I work as a family preservation counselor with, I have an expressive arts therapist that I work with, as well as a play therapist in my building at Squamish Nation, Iasmin Child and Family Services. And I love my work there. I would never, ever give it up for anything. It's just, you know, for my own community, I get so much satisfaction out of it.
Yeah.
But I think look to the place where I think instead of trying to aim for anything elaborate or very specific, I noticed that patterns develop in relationships. When people are coming repeatedly, there's certain things that happen. And I know with our play therapist, with the children, there's a ritual that occurs each and every time where the child comes in and there's this greeting process, and then they ask for a snack, and then they, there's all these sort of things that happen ritualistically, repeatedly as the child enters in. And then I know that part of what our play therapist does is at the end, they light a candle together. That's a ritual. That's a ritual, and it brings the child into rest. It creates a kind of safety you can count on. The child knows, and she I know gets concerned if something's going on in our building, like construction or something that prohibits that from happening, because it changes something so important for the child. It also, for the parents, ritualizing, how I am and how we enter into every single session. I don't necessarily have to talk about that with the parent. I can just be noticing and creating a certain kind of an environment and having steps occur for them in a very repeated way every single time that brings some rest into their system. I mean, there's more specific things you can do, like smudging, and having your feather there, or going for a walk. These can all be ritualized things. So it doesn't have to be big and complex or overwhelming or scary for people. It can be small. Start with small things, but remember, it's an intended pattern of actions that is repeated for a purpose other than the actions themselves. So it's not just smudging for the purpose of smudging. It creates a kind of safety. It creates that sacred space that someone's entering into where they can rest.
Almost like indirectly illustrating the benefits of it, like we talked about before, right? In terms of indirectly passing on wisdom and how that's kind of an effective lesson there, right?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, if you have any clarification you'd like to offer for that, we're more than happy to take it. But we'll move on for now. We have another question from Lynn. Do you feel that the ritual of breaking bread is not as important because we have moved away from our communities with multi-generations and we're now living in cities with kind of in vertical neighborhoods? I assume they mean like apartment buildings.
Yeah.
It seems to be throughout the world this is happening.
So this is for eating together.
Yeah.
I think actually I don't think it's lost importance. I think it's not a priority for us. And I think that we've lost touch with a part of all cultures that has, been repeated since the beginning of time, because our lifestyles have changed and our priorities have changed.
Yeah.
We're economically driven, and I think we're suffering from the loss of that ritual, not knowing why we're suffering, not knowing that we've this simple thing that doesn't look like such a big deal actually is a very big deal. A lot goes on when we sit down at a table together, and that is a repeated thing that we do. Now, I'm going to give an example that hopefully will speak to everybody. But my grandmother, when she was alive, always cooked Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas dinner, Easter dinner, right? Those are three big dinners in the family. And the meal's always the same, right? Yep. You have the turkey, you have the ham, you have the stuffing, you have the mashed potatoes, you have the, all the fixings, and it's done in a certain way. And people count on this, but we don't know how much we count on it until one year Grandma says, I'm not doing Thanksgiving dinner this year. And everyone says, oh, What? Because we should be able to take this for granted, you see. This is Thanksgiving weekend coming up. And so my grandmother's passed now, and my Aunt Carol has taken on the role of doing Thanksgiving dinner. And I don't even really like turkey very much, but I count on that dinner.
Yeah.
I count on that dinner, not just for the food, but for what happens around the food.
Yeah.
Right? I get to see all my cousins. We get to be in her home, in the warmth and the safety of her home. There's relationship building that goes on. There's laughter. There's all sorts of things that go on around the food. But we don't realize why. That's what I was trying to say earlier. It's like we've lost these things that we were never meant to talk about. And we're suffering because we've lost them. And yet we don't know what it is. And so now we have to talk about them and make them conscious. And that's kind of that's where I feel conflicted. It's like we've lost something so important, and now we have to talk about it. And in talking about it in a way, it's like we were never meant to talk about these things. They were just meant to occur. Right? Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we can take we'll take one more question from Chelsea. Tansy, I am an Indigenous social work student at Yellowhead Tribal College in Edmonton. Right on. I have a question regarding how we carry ourselves during rituals. How would you suggest we channel that part of ourselves to live and go back to that source?
How we carry, let me see, I can see the question there. Sometimes when I read something, I can comprehend it differently. I have a question regarding how we carry ourselves during it. How would you suggest we channel that part of ourselves to live and go back to that source? So when we're outside of the ritual, how do we carry ourselves the same way that we're inside of ritual? Well, I think that is a good question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is I think that would be a very individual thing. I think that you would have to have had many experiences of having a part of yourself called upon during ritual. Because if you think about it, we kind of have a ritual here, you know.
You and I?
Yeah, like I come in and there's a certain pattern of things. I know there's a paper I have to sign. There's a tea. There's, and I know that's going to happen. And there's some comfort in that for me. And then there's a ritual in terms of how, I'm doing this presentation now, and there's an aspect of myself that gets evoked that you might not normally see in me at home or walking down the street, but there's a part of me that wakes up and is in the lead right now. And that part is always there. It's just certain conditions call that part out.
Right.
Does that make sense? It's really powerful when you think about it, that ritual can call upon aspects. And actually what ritual can do, which I think is so fascinating, is that we can try on different aspects of ourselves. We have the luxury of being something other than what we normally are. In a ritual.
Yeah.
Yes. And so it makes room to express things that maybe we wouldn't normally have room for.
Yeah.
And to play with different aspects of the self. So for that reason, they're really powerful and really, really important. But I think a person would have to have an experience of this aspect of themselves and to recreate the conditions that would call upon that part of oneself. And if you think about, there's a zillion different methods for self-actualization. I mean, there's mindfulness stuff, and every religion has sort of different practices. But I mean, I certainly see, contemplative practices or mindfulness practices or different cultural or religious practices. You can be mindful at any point. There can be a ritual you have for yourself every single day that calls upon this part of us, that calls that part of us forth, so that part of us is leading. That's my intuitive. It's a great question, and it's giving me lots to think about. But that's my intuitive answer to that. I can really see that for myself too. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you all very much for those questions. I'll just quickly recognize Susan. Susan says counseling shift thinking into the session is the ritual, and then follows it up with life is the ritual. That's an interesting thought, Susan. Do you have any responses to that? Life is the ritual?
Well, absolutely, we can look at that in that way if there's a repeated, and some people, I mean, if you think about, you know, you look to Tibet and you see the Buddhist monks living their life, and they're in a constant ritual. Their whole life is ritualized. Everything about it, and it keeps them in this very sacred place that's transcendent of the day to day. Right? So absolutely we can. Yeah.
Thanks very much, everyone. Those questions were awesome.
So here, let's look at sort of what are the properties of play and connecting them to ritual, because to me this is so, I mean, it's there inherently, but to just draw these out and to become aware of these things. Then we can start to look at what is the practical application here, right? Rituals and the 7 properties of play. And this comes from research on play. And like I said, there's play is a hot topic these days. You hear it all over the place. And play, I've said this before when I was here earlier this year, that our understanding of play has been fairly reductionistic. It's not just for kids. Play is a state, not necessarily an activity,
Totally.
So the parameters, and this is when you think about a circle too, when you go around, it has a clear beginning and a clear ending. And that is really important, actually, because when you enter into a ritual, you're suspended in this space and time. Actually, time is suspended, and there's room for us to be other than what we are on a day-to-day basis, and there's room for maybe emotions that we have not expressed or can't express or don't have room or time to express otherwise, and it creates some safety because we know it's a time. There's like brackets in time and space. We're in this container. There's a clear beginning and there's a clear end to it. If there was no end to it, which actually helps me answer the question we just talked about. I mean, yes, there are people who live in this constant state of like ritualization, but when you're thinking about, especially with children, a ritual, there has to be a beginning and an ending to it. It has to be contained for it to be safe. Play has to be contained for it to be safe. And from a brain science perspective, the play mode, we shift into it. But we don't stay in it forever because there's other priorities. There is work that needs to get done, and there is relationship stuff that needs to get done. Those are sort of the 3 primary drives is the drive for attachment, to play, and to work that is found in all mammals. So that creates some safety, the parameters. Right. It has to be engaging. And I think I've seen this, and when I read this and talked about this with Dr. Neufeld, it became so clear to me. A ritual has to be engaging. Play has to be engaging. Rituals can only work to the degree that the participant is fully engaged. So you have to become engaged and give yourself over to the ritual. If we stay, and I've seen this so many times, when people stay in the evaluation mode, when I do any kind of process work or training and we do a circle, if people stay in outside of it and they don't give themselves over to it and they stay in the mode of evaluation, they don't get the benefits of it. They don't benefit from that process because they're evaluating it. They're staying on the outside. They're not giving themselves fully over to it.
They're creating that separation between themselves and what's happening. Right?
Yeah, they're not getting the full experience. I mean, there has to be safety for that too. To give ourselves over. And for me, I have been part of rituals that at first I felt resistance, but then something happens and I'm in it. And I can feel that shift and my receptivity, and now I'm part of it. It's a very different experience than being on the outside of it. Definitely. Freedom, ritual must be freely entered, although volition is suspended in the ritual. So we can't force someone to do it. They won't get the benefit of it.
Yeah.
They have to freely enter into it. And so that has to be done too through attachment, through relationship. A person there has to be some trust there, some safety for a person to choose. I mean, especially with children, we cannot force it. It has to spontaneously occur. We have to freely enter it. But once we're in it, now we're not imposing our will. Mm-hmm. Now we're part of it again, and we're moving with this experience.
Right. Yeah.
Expression. Rituals would seem ideally suited to facilitate emotional expression or enable the recovery of feelings. So as I said, in a ritual, there would be certain emotions that could be freely expressed that maybe wouldn't be appropriate somewhere else. One of the things in my research that I found around rituals, especially around death rituals, was the wailing. Or the dirges that they're called. Like most cultures had people, wailers, that they would call in, criers, that would moan and have this like just heart-wrenching sort of cry to evoke crying on behalf of the others, that the grievers, the ones that had suffered the loss, to invite them into this expression of this emotion.
Yeah. Okay.
To permit it, to invite it.
Yeah. To create that space to almost to socially give permission.
Yes.
to let those emotions kind of flow.
Yes. Yes. And there was a whole period of history where that was the norm, and then something happened somewhere along the way, and it did have to do with religion and the church, and where it now grieving had to be done, like suffering, and so like you get over it right away. You don't do that, and so some of those rituals have been lost, and I certainly can see the difference. I've had many different experiences of different people and how they grieve, and just find it very interesting how in some cultures the expression, and I know in our own culture and in the Indigenous world that, and I'll hear people say, oh, well, you shouldn't cry for too long, but you do need a period to cry. And that in my research, I found that as well, that there was a time where that was facilitated. There were rituals for crying and wailing and making all the noise, because that was a very important part of the process. There's
an interesting thought. Let me go on a tangent for a second.
Go
here,
for
and
it.
You can either respond, or you can just continue reading and pretend I never said anything.
Okay, go ahead.
It's interesting that you brought up the kind of the insertion of the church and their kind of. And when I say the church, I assume we're talking mostly about the Christian church here.
Well, I want to be careful because I don't ever want to be divisive, and I mean, there's a book actually called The Mourner's Dance, if anyone's interested, that outlines all of this.
Okay.
Grieving rituals of different cultures, and it just talks historically about there was a certain period in history where and in all cultures, and you'll see this in Maori, Hawaiian, Aztec, that there's wailers, or they're called dirges, I believe. And they would do this ritual where they would help the family or help the ones who'd lost somebody to have an emotional letdown.
Yeah.
And then at some point in history, there was a shift, and the church was part of that, but I'm not even going to. It's on the tip of my tongue, and I can't look at. If you're really interested, order the book.
Okay.
But then there was a shift where it was like, now, no, you didn't have the body laid out to view. You didn't have all these things. It was about putting it behind you and getting on with it. Yeah.
So this kind of the thought that came to mind was like through let's just say broadly through colonization, right? And how certain cultures kind of take over. Or take space from other cultures, let's say, influences. Do you think that there's any sort of genetic link for people and the kind of rituals that they may need? Because rituals, as you said, rituals are present throughout the world, but they're also distinct. And, I'm sure that, the church broadly
Yeah.
it came from somewhere. It was a
We
culture
could
that
say
came
religion,
from somewhere,
you
right?
know, it's
Okay.
yeah.
So, but that stance, I guess, that
Yeah.
stance on how the grieving process should be approached came from
Yes.
somewhere. It
Yes.
wasn't pulled from the ethereal. It
Yeah.
was something that existed,
Something happened, yeah.
and it was then transitioned
Correct.
to
There was
become
an
the grieving
influence.
process, to influence for a wide variety of people
Yes.
that we're now discussing that might not necessarily be beneficial for everyone in an equal way.
Yeah.
So I guess that's kind of the root of my question.
Yes.
Coming back around to it, do you think that there is some sort of precedent for the types of grieving rituals that people need?
What I
And
will
are they
say,
different?
what I will say about that is that on a neurobiological level,
Mhm.
like in the limbic system, in terms of our attachment needs, the instincts to play, the need for tears, how we recover, in essence, is the same process across the board. How a given culture facilitates that, what kinds of rituals have developed
Right.
in a given culture. I mean, the influences would be, I can imagine, geographical, like,
Yeah.
you know, the land that
Mhm.
the culture is based in,
Yeah.
the seasons, and all of these sorts of different things. But truly, honestly, this is why this is so important that we're talking about this, because we're not saying one ritual is better for a people than this ritual or whatever it is, but
Mhm.
there's certain conditions that must be universally present
Right.
for it to result in healing.
Mhm. Okay.
And so what we now know is that rituals facilitate emotional expression, which is required for healing.
Mhm.
So we know this scientifically now. Our people knew this all along,
Yeah.
intuitively, and that's why they had these things that they repeated without question. And somewhere along the lines, there was an influence that said, no emotional expression. Retrospectively, we can look now and go, yeah, that's not good for
Mhm.
people
Right.
to not have emotional expression. People can't heal without emotional expression.
Mhm.
So how, you know, facilitating a ritual where
Mhm.
emotional expression is invited, it's safe, it's encouraged, and it spontaneously brings people to that place,
Mhm.
that's good for them.
Yeah.
That's part of how healing occurs, and that's the power a ritual holds, you
Mhm.
see. We don't really have to talk about it. We just do it.
Yeah.
We enact it. We invite people into that. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah. So I don't think it has, like I said, you could look, and for those of you interested in, like, Joseph Campbell's a great one too. For those of you who don't know who that is, he's a American mythologist and master teacher. He's passed now, but he wrote all kinds of books, and he's studied the mythologies from the beginning of time of all different cultures, civilizations, and he talks in a very universal way about these same sorts of things.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you. I think that yeah, you know, I'm still so that process or that influence that said no grieving must have worked for someone, no? Or like, why would it have come about? Do you
Well,
know what I mean?
I'm not saying it didn't work, but there's a
Yeah.
cost to things that work as well. So
Right,
we can
okay.
connect that back to some evidence-based practices that we still see today because
Yeah.
it worked.
Right.
Well, yes, it worked. It got a result.
Mm-hmm. So really, it's a matter of prioritization. Then,
But is there a
almost.
cost?
Yeah.
What is the cost
Yeah.
to that
I see.
practice? Yes, it got people to move on and get on,
Yeah.
but you know what was lost?
Mm-hmm.
What was lost with the loss of emotional expression? And so, you know, ritual can contain the messiness of the human experience and human emotion. You know, ritual can create a space for emotional expression that wouldn't otherwise be appropriate
Mm-hmm.
or welcome or
Yeah.
invited.
Gotcha.
It gives it room,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes it okay, and it says this is okay here.
Mm-hmm.
You can have this, right? A great example, when I did talk to Dr. Neufeld this week, and I said, wow, you know, my emotions they blindsided me 2 years later. I couldn't believe the boys and I were right back in the thick of this
Mm-hmm.
grieving process when I thought we'd made so many, and we've cried our tears, and we've made such progress in terms
Mm-hmm.
of getting on with our lives. And he said, well, you need a ritual for your sadness. And he said, the thing about emotions, he says, if the sadness feels, this is really profound, if the sadness feels like it's having to chase you, you will be haunted by it. And I thought, oh my goodness, that is so true.
Yeah.
And he said, so how do you create ritual for you and the boys, and that we have a date with our sadness? We look at the pictures, we listen to the songs, we tell the stories, and we have our tears once a month. That can be ritualized.
Yeah.
So that our sadness doesn't have to be haunting us to get some airtime, chasing us. Because that's what I said to him. As I said, it felt like my emotions all caught up with me.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever felt like that? It's like just out of nowhere, and it's just all catches up. You can't run from it anymore. It gets you eventually. And so ritual is, we get to be intentional with this. And we just do this thing. And it facilitates that bounce back for people. Yeah. And that's, I suspect, part of why we do a potlatch, or why we do a memorial. A big memorial is like, we're making some time to acknowledge the loss, you know, and to hold on to, you know, this person that's on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Sorry. I'm just processing what you're saying a lot. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, and I think last but not least is ritual can allow for emotional expression that would otherwise be alienating or inappropriate. So it's safe. And part of, and I keep going to the grieving piece because I've been through it and I'm living through it, but also it is the universal experience. And the earliest rituals were grieving and death rituals, but emotion can be alienating. It can alienate us from other people. If our emotion starts leaking out all over the place, and we can't contain it because we're not making any room for it, because that's what happens, it can be perceived as problematic, and it can interfere with our relationships. So ritual is a safe place where it's allowed and invited. It's not going to break any relationships. You're not going to be judged for it in that way. And so even frustration or anger. And I think about some of our dancing rituals, and I've got some pictures of, maybe we'll go to the next one. These, actually, no, I won't go there yet. But dancing rituals and mass dancing, it's like when we put on different masks. I mean, dancing, we're moving our body in a certain way, but we put on different masks, and we can find expression for all different aspects of ourselves. In a dance ritual, we can dance out and play out our frustration or our anger about a situation. And in the work that I do with parents and children who have suffered huge injustices because of their own traumatic experiences and their stuckness, and they are very angry and very frustrated, if there isn't space for them to find expression for that, it is going to come out in all the wrong places and all the wrong ways.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. And so ritual creates and contains, it creates an environment, and it creates a container for emotional expression to happen that would otherwise be harmful, potentially harmful to our relationships and our reputation. So you can see how people are walking like, if you just try that on for a minute, the fact that people aren't having these opportunities, that they're not, the rituals haven't been passed down to them, daily rituals, or weekly rituals, or monthly rituals, or grieving rituals, or whatever kind of ritual a person, you can see the impact on that in the lives of the people in our communities. You can see the emotions coming out or being internalized harmfully for people, because they're not being invited into places where it can move, and that is so necessary for healing to occur. How are we doing for questions?
I think we might have one new one. One big one. Okay, so Tanya, one part of our lives as Indigenous peoples, not usually spoken about, is the rituals of war or warring. Our men and women in some tribes had very specific rituals that must have helped the men to grow as people. These rituals are no longer there, so what do our men do in lieu of? I feel like this is part of a bigger, bigger question. I feel that it's a big, important part of our traditional lives, and maybe it has a role to play even today. My son is an athlete, and we speak with him about how his sport now takes the place of the physicality of our people.
Totally.
Especially because the communities play against each other for bragging rights and pride.
Yeah.
I want to gain knowledge in this area.
Yeah.
I absolutely, yeah.
Perfect.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is a great example because let's face it, in war, it's perfectly acceptable to take a life.
Yeah.
It's not acceptable to take a life outside of the context of war.
Yeah.
Right? We had all sorts of these different kinds of things, and we have kids now, and I had this really interesting conversation with Dr. Neufeld about it, when we have a child who harms an animal or kills an animal. And the conversation that ensued was that if that child was taken into relationship with a wise elder, and that wise elder took that child out into nature and taught that child to hunt, and that child killed that animal in a hunting ritual, that would be acceptable. It's all about context. And if the child did this outside of the ritual, outside of that context, and outside of the relationship with a wise elder, and now we've got a problem.
Yeah.
Do you see how the loss of culture is so profound? And we went on to talk about, you know, better he killed a bird than a dog, because no one can forgive that. Or a baby. That will never be forgiven. And so how do we now bring our children into these rituals so that this is how we teach indirectly, you see?
Yeah.
What are the rules? When is it okay to do this? When is it not okay to do this? How is this done, and why did we do it? What's important about that? And so, no, you know, we can't take lives today. That is not okay. But we can certainly have rituals where we can dance out or play out this instinct. And I mean, some of our dances embody that kind of, it's that energy.
Yeah.
Right. And certainly sports as well. Now, sports, when it's goal oriented and it's outcome based, doesn't bring rest. So that wouldn't necessarily count as a healing thing because it's competitive and there's a goal. When we're in a ritual, there is not a goal. It's not work oriented. We're not working towards anything. We are immersed in the experience.
Right.
And the energy is moving and the emotions are moving.
Right.
So that we have to differentiate that. But we certainly can bring that same part of ourself or aspect to ourself to athletics.
Yeah. And also I assume, you know, when we're kind of looking at it, there's rituals around, you know, because even if we think about the context of war, putting ourselves back there was an outcome, there was a goal that we wanted. We wanted X,
to win,
whatever it was, right? But there must have been rituals around that period, you know, where we're not thinking about the goal, we're thinking about just getting into that. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So, my good friend Splash, who's been here with Mel Rivers before, my grandfather was given the name, and it was kind of he was on Canoe Journey. My grandfather's passed now, but he used to accompany, like do the guide boat for the canoe journeys, travel journeys.
Okay, cool.
Because he was a fisherman and he had a boat, and so he would go along with all the rowers, and then they'd set up camp for the night or whatever. And so some of the folks, Splash being one of them, gave my grandfather this name, and I think it's I'm gonna say it wrong, Slakowitz, I think, and that name was very appropriate for him. But the name what means going into the world naked, and Splash elaborated and went on to say that there was a certain kind of warrior in the long ago that when they went out to as a warrior, they would go completely naked with they would put oil on their body, and they would go with just like their spear and in their canoe. And that's it. And they would go just with their own selves. And so there would be this whole ritual around preparing oneself for that.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do. Cool.
So yeah, that's the ritual preceding something.
Yeah.
Preparing us
for the event that is,
that isn't the ritual.
Yeah. I see what you're saying.
That's real life. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. Tanya, thanks very much for that question.
I hope I answered it. I don't know if I did.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, it's a really big one.
You guys are giving me such good things to think about, and I will go away and think about these things more.
Yeah, we have a part 2.
Yeah. I need to dive into it more. Like I said, I'm just at the beginning of exploring all this, and I'm excited to be fleshing it out and just to have a context to be able to discuss it.
Yeah.
So let's go to the next slide. So rituals and the 7 properties of play. This is really important. I've mentioned these 2 things already, that it's not work.
Yeah.
Rituals do the work. Participants are meant to rest from their work. The ritual takes over. The work of attachment and volition are suspended. So we're not working at relationship, and we're not working at imposing our will or making any decisions. Participants do not need to know the purpose of the work for it to be effective. That is something, isn't it?
I'm talking a little bit about, we kind of talked about this earlier, right? Like not knowing the purpose of it, and that's kind of part of the great mystery of it.
And it's been really tough for me to enact this in the work that I do in community when I'm invited in, because of how my work has evolved and my particular path, that I'm really trying to honor an Indigenous pedagogy or an Indigenous way of knowing and being, which is rooted more in ritual and process and experiential. And then people say, well, I need to know what, and that takes away from it, you see.
Yeah.
It's a different paradigm. It's a very different paradigm.
Yeah. And I think I love that you brought it up, because I've been having kind of conversations, in my personal life as well, about kind of the way that we as society and we as individuals have really kind of shifted in the last little while. And we talked earlier about religion, and I feel very strongly that that I am kind of a follower in the religion of the scientific method, in that observations need to be quantified, and I need to see facts, and I need to see real numbers about the real world around me. I need to make observations about it.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? And if I don't, then it's not real. And you see that everywhere across all, disciplines, all the time. It's that scientific model. It's kind of, and I'm not very clear here. I am not saying the scientific model is a negative thing, but in some contexts, there is no need to observe.
There's a place for it.
What I mean?
There's a place for it. And then there is a place to acknowledge the mystery of life and the life force and the energy that is not quantifiable, that is in everything.
Yeah.
You see, that moves in everything, and the great mystery. And it is there. And science acknowledges that. Science acknowledges its own limits.
If it doesn't, it's not real science.
Yeah. Yes, it has its limitations in terms of explaining things. And any good scientist will be the first to say that.
And I think that almost illustrates kind of a divide or a difference between kind of the way that that a lot of people, or that the general society, views science as being something that it really isn't. Do you know what I mean? Like, people that have engaged in science for a long time are active scientists, and that can be anybody. You don't need to be a degree to be a scientist. I want to be very clear about that. The recognize limitations and just the basis of what we're doing here.
Yes.
A scientist is constantly out to prove things as being wrong or incorrect, and if they can't prove it, the result of a test or the result of a study is not I have proven X.
No,
it is I have not proven X.
Yes.
These things remain possible.
Yes.
That's what the point of it is.
Absolutely. There's all these possibilities.
There's always the pursuit of more knowledge. That's the point of science.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people take a different shift into science, and they see a conclusion and they think, you see it all the time,
It's like reductionistic thinking. Yeah.
Tumors in rats reduce in size, and then people
Right.
all of a sudden write these ridiculous titles like, oh, we've cured science, or we've
Right.
cured cancer.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah,
you know what I mean?
yeah.
And it's just people look at conclusions from science as being something that they're not. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
Went on a tangent there.
Well, it's okay. I think science and mystery go hand in hand, and it's about understanding things, making sense of things, but there is a acknowledgement that there's a mystery there that has to be honored, and our people knew that.
Yeah.
Right. And here's the other thing about ritual and play: it's not for real, and it shouldn't be for real. And I got caught on this one. I said to Gordon, but it is real. And he said, well, let's talk about this. So ritual is to be differentiated from everyday reality. This is exactly what we were just talking about. From the mundane or trivial, from the seen or empirical world, from the purely physical versus metaphysical world, from the material versus emotional or spiritual world, from the temporal world with its consciousness of time. So when we go into a ritual, time and space, it's like we're suspended in time and space, and we are in the mystery, and there's something else unfolding, and we give ourselves over to this for a time.
Yeah.
And so you can see the benefits of that. Of being able to do this, and having someone lead us through this, and having these things on a regular basis, not just for ceremony, but what are our daily rituals? What are our family rituals? What are our work rituals? And I know in my workplace, I don't know if she's called a director anymore or what she's called, but Kelly McReynolds is in charge of Child and Family Services for the Squamish Nation. And one of the things that she's enacted in the workplace is on Monday mornings and Friday afternoons, elders come in and they do a blessing and they brush everybody off. It's ritual. So people know, okay, I can start my week this way. You enter into this space, you feel taken care of, you surrender to that, and then at the end of the week before you leave, you do the same thing. That's a ritual. So there isn't really a limit to what it can be. It just needs to embody or to have these properties in there, which I'll go over again quickly. Okay, let's go back here. So there needs to be a clear beginning and a clear ending. It needs to be engaging. It will only work if the participant is fully engaged. Can't make them do it. Freedom. It must be entered into freely. So a person makes a decision, says yes to it, but then once they're in it, they don't have to make any decisions. The ritual does the work. It makes the decisions for them. It facilitates emotional expression. That emotions that wouldn't otherwise be welcome are free to be expressed in a ritual. And it's safe. It's safe. So whatever happens in the ritual, there aren't going to be repercussions from that. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here, and I can answer questions, or we can talk a little bit more.
Sure.
And like I said, I'm just at the beginning of this journey of unfolding this, and I'm going to be doing more research and probably doing more talks on this, which is really exciting for me. But I'm really looking at my own life too, and seeing, what are the rituals that are inherently there. And what are the ones that need to be created for my own family?
Yeah. Which I think is such it's kind of the crux, that makes your perspective so valuable, I think, for so many, is not only are you an expert, not only do you engage in this material in a teaching context, but you also live it and you facilitate it and you bring it into your own your family life. You know what I mean? So you simultaneously offer the raw knowledge, the time that you've went and spent in learning this, but also the anecdotal knowledge that people value as well, in terms of, okay, I did this, or I tried this and it didn't work, or I tried this and this worked out with these little tweaks. Do you know what I mean? So just my thought on it, but I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I'm trying.
Aren't we all? So we do have another question from Lynn. She starts it off by saying, my participation is strictly for interest. However, I think we need to begin by inviting individuals to rituals, because if you're not invited, you tend not to know or appreciate your culture.
Yeah.
It becomes a teaching moment if you're invited. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it needs to be all inclusive, and I think we need to transcend these ideas about, you know, it being only for these people or only for this family or only for, we need rituals where everyone's invited into it. These sort of more universal types of things that people can engage in. That would facilitate being together, safety, expression of emotion, little things and big things.
Yeah, totally. And I think also kind of inviting as many people into the space as possible in the context of like our perspective as Indigenous people, it safeguards that knowledge, right? Because we all know kind of what can happen with the eradication of culture that's happened in Canada and North America more broadly. The more people we can have that participate in culture generally, it's going to safeguard that knowledge for the future generations.
Yes.
Which I think is equally important.
This isn't part of my presentation, but I do want to say, and it is a discussion I had with Dr. Neufeld, that rituals can be abused too. They can be. And we need to watch that. We need to be mindful of that.
When you say abused, can you kind of elaborate? Do you mean like used too often or used inappropriately? Or?
I would say used for the wrong reasons.
Okay.
Yes, used for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
That could be harmful for people.
Would imagine even harmful to kind of the validity of the ritual and rituals more broadly itself, right? That kind of takes away from that.
Yeah, it's a sacred thing.
Yeah.
And so if a person is using it for their own devices, or to forward an agenda, or to brainwash people, or to, that kind of thing, it's not going to have a healing impact.
Yeah. Kind of a perverse kind of taking of that. So we have a couple more questions. One actually from Kaylin, our program assistant. Can rituals help us mourn species loss? Do you think there's a place for ritual in doing so?
That's interesting. Can he elaborate for me a bit?
Kaylin, so I imagined she meant like species loss as it relates to kind of climate change and as we kind of the difficulty that our the natural world is facing at this point. Do you see value in ritual in helping us kind of navigate that? Because in my opinion, there is mourning that needs to happen for that.
Loss.
As we lose species. Because it does happen.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm pointing out here, I mean, ritual, if these properties are there, can facilitate healing and growth and adaptation.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, a ritual to grieve the loss of a species, of course, I think that would be beneficial.
Yeah. So part of that grieving process, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're changing. The world's changing at such a rapid rate right now. We can't even keep up with what's going on.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. And actually, I have to say that when you look at Indigenous cultures, that the way that Joseph Campbell explains it is that, we don't personify the universal energy, whatever you want to call it, the life force, the energy. We experience continuity through plants and animals and the land.
Yeah.
You see. Whereas in other cultures, that life force energy is personified as God. And this sort of separate thing. Whereas with Indigenous people, the life force energy is in everything. And so an ancestor dies and they come back as a yotes or a killer whale or a orca or whatever you have it, right? Or it's in the rock, the grandfather rock type of thing. So whenever, there's destruction of land or the taking of the life of an animal or a creature, or even harvesting plants, there's an acknowledgement, there's some sort of ritual that goes with that to honor the transformational process and the continuity of life from this form to that form.
Yeah.
You see, that's always been part of Indigenous lifeway.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. So we have a couple comments here from Susan. Denise, you are great. A lot to think about. How
Thank you.
And Tanya says, I appreciate the idea that rituals can be daily occurrences as well as ceremonious. There's 2 boys, one who's 13, and I'm trying to find the guides to help me with his rites of passage from boy to man, which I'm sure that you can empathize with and understand is difficult.
Yes. Yeah, and I just did a puberty rite ceremony for my son earlier this year, and it was really, really lovely. And what I thought was great is I was able to give myself over to that ritual. I didn't have a role in it other than to participate, and my boys had no role. They just were part of it. And I will see the benefits of that as time moves on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. So please feel free to populate the chat box if you have any last comments or questions for Denise. I'm going to do my typical plug here. We had to reschedule our session for that was originally scheduled for next week. It'll be in December now, correct?
Yeah, sorry, I just
totally
needed extra time.
Totally okay. I'm glad now because we'll have some time, or you'll have some time to really invest in this, and we'll come back kind of ready to fire firing on all cylinders. So we'll have that in early December. Coming up later on in October, we have a special guest. We have a community nurse coming to talk to us today about the value of the role that she plays in her community and kind of what community nursing can bring to our community. So I'm really excited for that. And then transitioning into November, we have a bunch of sessions. I think we have like 7 or something on the docket for November. Wow. So stay tuned as we kind of populate that. It's a very busy month for us. Yeah.
Holy cow.
So yeah.
That's great though.
Tanya has another comment. After listening to you today, I feel confident that the daily rituals we have as a family are helping us grow as people. Thank you. Denise, I give my condolences to you today. I took part in your workshop with TB champions, and I remember your story. I give you, she says, I give you thanks because I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't want to butcher it on camera. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your comments and your engagement. We really appreciated it today. If there's nothing else, I think that'll be it. That'll be it for today.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care. Until next time. Bye-bye.